The moving truck had barely stopped when the sirens began wailing. Sarah Martinez watched in horror as 3 police cars surrounded her new property. Their red and blue lights painting her dream home in an ominous glow. She had no idea that her neighbors had been planning this moment for months. Sarah Martinez had saved for 15 years to buy her slice of paradise. The 3-acre property nestled in the foothills of Colorado's Rocky Mountains wasn't just a home. It was her sanctuary. After surviving a brutal divorce that left her financially devastated, the 42-year-old nurse had clawed her way back, working double shifts and living in a cramped apartment to save every penny for this moment. The property listing had been too good to be true. 3 acres of pristine land with a modest cabin, surrounded by towering pines and a crystal clear stream running through the back corner. The price was surprisingly reasonable, but Sarah's real estate agent, Jana Walsh, had explained that the previous owner was elderly and motivated to sell quickly. Sarah didn't question her luck out on moving day, September 15th, 2023. Sarah pulled up to her new home with everything she owned packed into a rented U-Haul truck. The morning sun filtered through the pine branches, casting dancing shadows across the wooden cabin that would soon be filled with her furniture, her books, her life. She had never felt more hopeful, but as she stepped out of her car, she noticed something unsettling. A group of well-dressed neighbors stood clustered near the property line, their faces stern and unwelcoming. At the center of the group was a woman with perfectly coiffed silver hair and a crisp navy blazer. Margaret Thornfield, president of the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. "Excuse me," Margaret called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You're trespassing on HOA property." Sarah's stomach dropped. "I'm sorry. There must be some mistake. I just bought this property. I have the deed right here." She fumbled in her purse for the legal documents, her hands trembling slightly. Margaret's smile was cold and calculating. "Oh, my dear, you've been terribly misinformed. This land has been designated as community green space for the past 18 months. The previous owner, Mr. Henderson, donated it to the HOA before his passing. You've been the victim of a fraudulent sale." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Fraudulent sale. The phrase echoed in her mind as she stared at the deed in her hands, the deed that had cost her every penny of her life savings, plus a mortgage that would take her 30 years to pay off. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered. Then louder, "That's impossible. I have title insurance. I have a clear deed. The county records show." "The county records are outdated," interrupted another neighbor, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who introduced himself as HOA Treasurer Bill Hendricks. "We've been working with the city to update them. This property legally belongs to the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association." Sarah felt the world spinning around her. She had quit her job in Denver, sold her furniture, burned every bridge to make this move possible. Now these people were telling her she had bought stolen property. "I need to call my real estate agent," she said, pulling out her phone with shaking hands. Margaret exchanged a meaningful look with Bill. "I'm afraid Jana Walsh is no longer practicing real estate in Colorado. Her license was revoked last month for irregularities in her transactions." The blood drained from Sarah's face. Jana had been recommended by a friend, had seemed so professional, so trustworthy. Now she was learning that her agent was a fraud, and where was Jana now? Sarah's calls went straight to voicemail, a voicemail box that was suddenly full. "Look," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice steady, "I understand there might be some confusion here, but I'm not leaving. I put everything I have into this property. If there's a legal issue, we'll sort it out through proper channels." Margaret's facade of politeness dropped. You have 1 hour to remove your belongings and vacate the premises. If you refuse, we'll have you arrested for trespassing. You can't do that. I have legal ownership. Do we need to call the police? Margaret pulled out her phone, finger hovering over the screen, because I assure you, Sheriff Davidson is very familiar with property disputes in our community. Sarah realized with growing dread that this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was orchestrated. These people had been waiting for her. They knew exactly what they were doing. For the next hour, Sarah made frantic phone calls while the HOA members watched her like vultures. Her attorney's office was closed for the weekend. The county clerk's office was closed. The title insurance company was closed. It was as if the entire system had conspired to leave her defenseless dot at exactly 1 p.m. Margaret made the call. Sheriff Davidson, yes, it's Margaret Thornfield. We have a trespassing situation at the Henderson property. The individual is refusing to leave HOA land. Yes, she claims to own it. But we have documentation proving otherwise. Thank you. We'll wait for your arrival. 20 minutes later, 3 patrol cars screamed up the mountain road, their sirens echoing off the canyon walls. Sheriff Davidson emerged from the lead car, a barrel-chested man with a gray mustache, who seemed to know Margaret quite well. Afternoon, Margaret, Bill. He nodded to the HOA members before turning to Sarah. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from the property. Sheriff, please, there's been a mistake. No mistake, ma'am. I've got a court order here signed by Judge Morrison, stating that this property belongs to the Pine Ridge HOA and that any unauthorized individuals are to be removed immediately. Sarah stared at the document in disbelief. A court order? When had there been a court hearing? How could there be a judgment without her being notified? This is impossible. She breathed. I wasn't served with any legal papers. I wasn't given a chance to defend myself in court. Sheriff Davidson's expression softened slightly. Ma'am, I understand this is upsetting, but I have to enforce this order. You can contest it through proper legal channels, but right now, I need you to gather your belongings and leave the premises. As Sarah stood there, surrounded by police officers and hostile neighbors, watching the moving truck driver nervously shift from foot to foot, she realized she was facing something much bigger than a simple property dispute. This was a coordinated attack designed to steal everything she had worked for. But Margaret Thornfield had made one critical mistake. She had assumed that Sarah Martinez was just another victim who would quietly disappear. She had no idea that the soft-spoken nurse she was trying to destroy had survived an abusive marriage, put herself through nursing school while raising 2 children alone, and had developed a spine of steel forged in the fires of adversity. As the police escorted her off what should have been her property, Sarah turned back to look at Margaret one last time. The HOA president stood triumphant, arms crossed, watching her victory unfold. Sarah made a silent promise in that moment. She would uncover the truth. She would expose every lie, every forged document, every corrupt deal that had led to this moment. And when she was done, Margaret Thornfield would regret the day she decided to wage war against the wrong woman. The battle for Sarah's dream home was about to begin. Sarah Martinez sat in her car at a gas station 10 miles down the mountain, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The events of the afternoon replayed in her mind like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Everything she owned was still packed in that U-Haul truck, which now sat in a storage facility because she had nowhere else to put it. She had driven straight to the county clerk's office first thing Monday morning, determined to prove her ownership, but what she found there made her blood run cold. According to the records, The property had indeed been donated to the Pine Ridge HOA by Harold Henderson on March 15th, 2023, 6 months before Sarah had ever heard of the place. The donation paperwork looked official, complete with Henderson's signature and a notary seal, but Sarah remembered something crucial from her real estate transaction. Harold Henderson had died on February 8th, 2023. She had seen his death certificate as part of the estate sale documentation. How could a dead man donate property a month after his funeral? Armed with this discrepancy, Sarah marched to the office of her attorney, David Chen, a family law specialist who had helped her through her divorce. His face grew increasingly grim as he reviewed her documents. "Sarah, this is a sophisticated fraud," he said, spreading the papers across his desk. "Someone has forged Henderson's signature and backdated the donation, but proving it won't be easy, especially if they have a judge's backing." "What do you mean, a judge's backing?" David pointed to the court order that had been used to evict her. "Judge Morrison signed this, but look at the case number. There's no record of any hearing in the court system. Either this is completely fabricated, or there was an ex parte hearing, meaning only one side was present." Sarah felt her anger building. "So they went to court without telling me and got a judgment to steal my property? It looks that way. But here's what's interesting, ex parte orders like this are only supposed to be used in emergencies." "What emergency could justify seizing property from someone who legally purchased it?" That evening, Sarah checked into a motel and began her investigation. She started with Harold Henderson's family. His daughter, Patricia Henderson Clark, lived in Denver and was shocked to learn what had happened. "My father would never have donated that land to anyone," Patricia said over the phone, her voice shaking with emotion. "That property has been in our family for 60 years. Dad was planning to leave it to my children in his will. And besides, he could barely hold a pen in his final months because of his arthritis. There's no way he could have signed legal documents." Sarah asked Patricia to meet her the next day, and what the elderly woman brought with her changed everything. Patricia had saved her father's medical records from his final year, including detailed notes from his doctor about his deteriorating condition. "Look at this," Patricia said, pointing to a neurologist report dated January 15th, 2023. Dad was diagnosed with severe dementia 3 weeks before he died. The doctor clearly states that he was no longer competent to make legal decisions. He couldn't even remember my name half the time. Sarah felt a surge of hope. If Henderson was mentally incompetent when he allegedly donated the property, then the donation was invalid, but she needed more proof. That's when Patricia mentioned something that made Sarah's heart race. "You know, Dad had security cameras all around that property. He was paranoid about trespassers. The cameras were connected to a cloud storage service that I never bothered to cancel after he died. All the footage should still be there." Sarah spent the next 3 days reviewing months of security footage from the Henderson property. Most of it was uneventful deer crossing the yard, delivery trucks, the occasional hiker. But then she found something that made her gasp. The footage from March 10th, 2023, 5 days before the alleged donation, showed Margaret Thornfield and Bill Hendricks walking around the property with a third person Sarah didn't recognize. They spent over an hour examining the land, taking photos, and having what appeared to be an intense discussion near the property lines. But the real bombshell came from footage dated March 20th, 2023, 5 days after Henderson had supposedly donated the property. Margaret Thornfield was back, this time with a surveyor and what looked like an architect. They were clearly planning something, and they were planning it on property that had supposedly just been donated to them. The timing was too convenient. How had Margaret known to bring a surveyor just days after receiving a surprise donation? Sarah's investigation deepened when she discovered that Judge Morrison, who had signed the eviction order, was Margaret Thornfield's brother-in-law. This fact was not disclosed in any of the court documents, a clear violation of judicial ethics rules, but the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. While researching the HOA's financial records at the county assessor's office, Sarah discovered that Pine Ridge HOA had taken out a massive construction loan in April 2023. Just 1 month after the alleged donation, the loan application listed the Henderson property as collateral. This meant that Margaret and her HOA had used Sarah's property to secure a multi-million-dollar loan to build a luxury clubhouse and golf course. They had essentially stolen her land to finance their own development project. Sarah brought all of this evidence to David Chen, who whistled low as he reviewed the documents. "Sarah, this isn't just fraud, this is racketeering. We're talking about conspiracy, forgery, judicial corruption, and grand theft. The HOA has committed multiple felonies. So what do we do?" David's expression was serious. "We file a federal lawsuit. This crosses state lines because the construction loan involves out-of-state banks, which makes it a federal crime. But I have to warn you, these people have connections. Judge Morrison is just the tip of the iceberg. We're going up against a network of corruption that probably involves local politicians, law enforcement, and who knows who else." As if to prove David's point, Sarah's phone rang that evening. The caller ID showed Sheriff Davidson's number. "Ms. Martinez, this is Sheriff Davidson. I need you to come down to the station tomorrow morning. There are some questions about your conduct during the eviction that need to be addressed." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What kind of questions, ma'am?" "We've received reports that you may have threatened HOA members and damaged property during your removal. I suggest you bring a lawyer." After hanging up, Sarah realized the full scope of what she was facing. Margaret Thornfield wasn't just trying to steal her property, she was trying to destroy Sarah's life completely. False criminal charges would ruin her nursing career and any chance she had of fighting back legally. But Margaret had underestimated her opponent. Sarah had survived an abusive husband who had tried to gaslight her into believing she was crazy. She had worked her way through nursing school while caring for the small children and an alcoholic mother. She had rebuilt her life from nothing once before, and she could do it again. That night, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She called Patricia Henderson Clark and made a proposal. "Patricia, I want you to be my co-plaintiff in the federal lawsuit. This isn't just about my property anymore. They forged your father's signature and defiled his memory. They stole from his estate and violated his final wishes." Patricia didn't hesitate. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to help me get access to your father's house. If Margaret and her conspirators were planning this fraud for months, there might be evidence inside that they missed." The next morning, instead of going to the sheriff's station, Sarah and Patricia drove up to the Henderson property using Patricia's key. They entered Harold Henderson's old cabin, a smaller structure about a quarter mile from the main house where Sarah was supposed to live. What they found in Harold's desk would blow the entire conspiracy wide open. Hidden in a secret compartment that Patricia knew about from childhood was a folder containing photocopies of documents that made Sarah's knees weak, letters between Margaret Thornfield and a man named Robert Walsh, Jonna Walsh's husband, discussing their plan to acquire the Henderson property through fraudulent means. Email printouts detailing how they would use Judge Morrison to legitimize their theft. And most damning of all, a contract showing that Margaret had already sold development rights to the property to a major corporation before she had even stolen it. Sarah realized she was holding evidence of a conspiracy that went far beyond a simple property grab. This was a multi-million-dollar development scheme that had been in the works for over a year. Harold Henderson's death had simply provided the opportunity they needed to execute their plan. As Sarah photographed every document with her phone, she heard car engines approaching. Through the window, she saw 3 vehicles racing up the mountain. Road Sheriff Davidson's patrol car, Margaret Thornfield's Mercedes, and a black SUV she didn't recognize. They had been discovered, and from the speed at which the vehicles were approaching, Sarah realized that Margaret Thornfield was about to make her biggest mistake yet. The fight was about to escalate to a whole new level. 6 months later, Sarah Martinez walked into the federal courthouse in Denver with her head held high and a briefcase full of evidence that would expose one of the most audacious real estate frauds in Colorado history. The case had attracted national attention, with legal experts calling it a textbook example of small-town corruption gone wild. David Chan had recruited additional legal firepower in the form of Rebecca Santos, a federal prosecutor who had built her career dismantling organized crime networks. Together, they had assembled a case that read like a crime thriller complete with forged documents, judicial corruption, and a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of local government. Across the courtroom sat Margaret Thornfield, flanked by a team of expensive lawyers led by Marcus Blackwell, a notorious defense attorney known for getting white-collar criminals reduced sentences. Margaret had aged visibly in the 6 months since Sarah's eviction, her perfectly coiffed hair now showing gray roots, and her confident demeanor replaced by barely concealed panic. Judge Catherine Walsh, no relation to the crooked real estate agent, called the court to order. The irony of having an honest Judge Walsh preside over a case involving the fraudulent Jonna Walsh was not lost on anyone in the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Rebecca Santos began her opening statement. This case is about greed, corruption, and the lengths that some people will go to steal the American dream from hardworking citizens. The evidence will show that the defendants conspired for over a year to defraud not only Ms. Martinez, but also the estate of Harold Henderson and the taxpayers of Colorado. Santos methodically laid out the prosecution's case, the forged donation, documents, the backdated signatures, Judge Morrison's conflict of interest in ex parte ruling, the construction loan secured with stolen property. Each piece of evidence built upon the last, creating an overwhelming picture of systematic fraud. But it was the surprise evidence that Sarah and Patricia had discovered in Harold Henderson's cabin that truly devastated the defense. Santos displayed enlarged copies of the conspirators' own communications on screens throughout the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, these are the defendants' own words in their own handwriting. Santos announced dramatically, in this letter, dated February 1st, 2023, 7 days before Harold Henderson's death, Margaret Thornfield writes to Robert Walsh, "The old man is failing fast. We need to be ready to move the moment he's gone. Have Jonna prepare the fraudulent sale documents, and I'll handle Morrison." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Margaret Thornfield's face had turned ashen, and one of her lawyers was frantically whispering in her ear. Dos Santos continued, and here, in Robert Walsh's response, "Margaret, the Henderson property appraisal came back at $2.8 million. Even split for ways between you, me, Jonna, and Morrison, we're looking at $700,000 each. The buyer, this Martinez woman, will never know what hit her." The prosecution's case got stronger as the week progressed. Patricia Henderson Clark testified about her father's dementia and inability to sign legal documents. Medical experts confirmed that Harold Henderson's arthritis would have made it impossible for him to write the signature on the donation papers. Handwriting analysts testified that the signature was a clear forgery, but the most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source. Dr. James Morrison, Judge Morrison's own son, took the stand as a whistleblower witness. My father came home on March 15th, 2023, drunk and celebrating, Dr. Morrison testified, his voice heavy with shame. He said Margaret Thornfield had just made our family rich. He showed me a cashier's check for $100,000 that he said was his payment for handling a small legal matter. The defense's cross-examination was brutal, but Dr. Morrison held firm. My father is a corrupt judge who sold his integrity for money. I can't live with that knowledge without speaking the truth. Marcus Blackwell, Margaret's attorney, attempted to discredit the evidence by claiming it had been obtained illegally. Your Honor, the search of Harold Henderson's property was conducted without a warrant. All evidence obtained should be excluded as fruit of the poisonous tree. But Judge Walsh was having none of it. Mr. Blackwell, Patricia Henderson Clark had every legal right to enter her deceased father's property. There was no Fourth Amendment violation here. The defense's case crumbled further when Robert Walsh, facing his own federal charges, decided to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. Margaret came to me in January 2023 with a plan. Walsh testified via video link from protective custody. She said Harold Henderson was dying and his property was perfect for the luxury development she wanted to build. All we needed to do was wait for him to die, forge a donation to the HOA, and then sell the development rights to Pinnacle Corporation for $5 million. And how was Sarah Martinez selected as the victim? Santos asked. My wife Jana was supposed to find someone with limited legal knowledge and no family support, someone who wouldn't be able to fight back effectively. Sarah Martinez seemed perfect because she was a single woman starting over after a divorce. Margaret figured she'd just give up and walk away. The revelation that Sarah had been specifically targeted because she appeared vulnerable brought tears to her eyes, but her emotion quickly turned to satisfaction as Walsh continued his testimony. Margaret had everything planned out. Judge Morrison would issue an ex parte eviction order. Sheriff Davidson would enforce it. By the time anyone realized what happened, we'd have the property developed and the profits hidden in offshore accounts. The prosecution's final witness was FBI forensic accountant Maria Rodriguez, who had traced the money trail. Her testimony revealed that Margaret Thornfield had already received $1.2 million from Pinnacle Corporation as a down payment for development rights to property she didn't legally own. The defendants didn't just plan to steal Ms. Martinez's property, Rodriguez testified. They had already sold it and spent the money before she even moved. And Marcus Blackwell made a desperate attempt to save his client during closing arguments. Ladies and gentlemen, my client is a respected member of the community who has served on the whole board for 15 years. This is all a misunderstanding based on paperwork errors and miscommunication, but Rebecca Santos' closing argument demolished any sympathy the jury might have had for Margaret Thornfield. The defense wants you to believe this was all a big mistake. But mistakes don't involve forged signatures. Mistakes don't involve bribing judges. Mistakes don't involve specifically targeting vulnerable victims. This was a calculated, premeditated conspiracy to commit grand theft, and the defendants deserve to face the full consequences of their crimes. As the jury filed out to deliberate, Sarah felt a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. After 8 months of legal battles, sleepless nights, and financial hardship, she was finally going to get her day of reckoning. But Margaret Thornfield had one last card to play. During the lunch recess, she approached Sarah in the courthouse hallway, her mask of civility finally slipping completely. "You have no idea what you've done," Margaret hissed, her voice low and venomous. "Pinnacle Corporation doesn't just build developments. They have connections you can't imagine. Even if you win this case, you'll never be safe. They'll make sure you regret ever setting foot on that property." Sarah looked Margaret straight in the eye and smiled. "Margaret, you threatened the wrong woman. I've recorded every word you just said, and it's going straight to the FBI. You just added witness intimidation to your list of federal crimes." Margaret's face went white as Sarah held up her phone, the recording app clearly visible on the screen. 3 hours later, the jury returned with their verdict. As the foreman stood to read the decision, the courtroom fell silent. The moment of truth had finally arrived. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Walsh asked, her voice cutting through the tense silence of the packed courtroom. The jury foreman, a middle-aged accountant named Robert Chen, stood with the verdict papers in his trembling hands. "We have, Your Honor." Sarah Martinez felt her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone in the courtroom could hear it. 8 months of her life had led to this moment. Everything, her life savings, her reputation, her future hung in the balance on the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud. "How do you find the defendant Margaret Thornfield guilty?" "Your Honor." A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Margaret Thornfield's face crumpled as her expensive lawyers frantically shuffled papers. "On the charge of grand theft." "How do you find the defendant Margaret Thornfield guilty?" "Your Honor." "On the charge of racketeering under the RICO Act." "How do you find the defendant Margaret Thornfield guilty?" "Your Honor." The foreman continued through all 14 counts, each guilty verdict hitting Margaret like a physical blow. When he finished, she had been convicted on every single charge, a complete victory for Sarah and justice. But Judge Walsh wasn't finished. "Mr. Chen, I understand the jury has also reached a verdict on damages." "Yes, Your Honor. We award the plaintiff Sarah Martinez compensatory damages in the amount of $2.8 million, the full value of her stolen property. We also award punitive damages in the amount of $10 million to deter others from similar criminal conduct." Sarah felt her knees go weak. $12.8 million. She had gone from losing everything to becoming a millionaire in the span of 3 minutes. But the biggest shock was yet to come. "Your Honor," Rebecca Santos stood to address the court. "The government has additional charges to file based on evidence that came to light during the trial." Judge Walsh raised an eyebrow. "Additional charges?" "Yes, Your Honor. Our investigation has revealed that this conspiracy extends far beyond the defendants already charged. We have evidence that Pinnacle Corporation was not just a buyer of the fraudulently obtained property. They were the architects of the entire scheme." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Sarah turned to look at the gallery and noticed several men in expensive suits who had been attending the trial all week. FBI agents were now moving toward them. Dos Santos continued. "Pinnacle Corporation has been running similar land grab schemes across 6 states, specifically targeting rural properties owned by elderly or vulnerable individuals. They identify prime development land, research the owner's personal situations, and then orchestrate elaborate frauds to steal the property for pennies on the dollar." One of the men in suits, a distinguished-looking executive, who Sarah now realized was Pinnacle CEO, stood abruptly and headed for the exit. He didn't make it. FBI agents blocked his path and placed him in handcuffs as cameras flashed throughout the courtroom. Furthermore, Santos announced, Our forensic accountants have discovered that Judge Morrison was not just paid $100, zero for his participation in this scheme over the past 5 years. He has received over $2 million from various shell companies connected to Pinnacle Corporation for similar fraudulent rulings in other cases. The magnitude of the corruption was staggering. This wasn't just about Sarah's property, it was about a systematic criminal enterprise that had been operating for years, stealing millions of dollars worth of property from unsuspecting victims across multiple states. Judge Walsh called for order as the courtroom buzzed with excitement. Ms. Santos, how many additional victims are we talking about? At least 4 to 7 confirmed cases, Your Honor, with potential damages exceeding to $100 million. The FBI has opened investigations in Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, Montana, New Mexico, and Arizona. Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks. All those sleepless nights when she had wondered if she was crazy, if she had somehow imagined her legal ownership of the property. If she was just being paranoid about the conspiracy against her, it turned out she had uncovered something far bigger than she could have imagined. But the final twist came from an unexpected source. Patricia Henderson Clark, who had been sitting quietly in the gallery throughout the trial, stood up and asked permission to address the court. Your Honor, there's something else the court needs to know about my father's property. Judge Walsh looked surprised, but nodded for her to continue. When my father bought that land 60 years ago, he didn't just buy it as an investment. He bought it because he discovered something on the property that he kept secret his entire life. Patricia reached into her purse and pulled out a leather journal. This is my father's diary from 1963. In it, he writes about finding a natural hot spring on the back corner of the property, a spring that geological surveys now suggest could be worth over $50 million in geothermal energy rights. The courtroom fell silent. Margaret Thornfield's face had gone completely white. Patricia continued, my father never developed the spring because he wanted to preserve the land for future generations. But someone else knew about it. Someone who had access to old geological surveys and mining records. She turned to point directly at Margaret Thornfield. Margaret's late husband was a geological engineer who worked for the state in the 1980s. He would have had access to those old survey records. This whole conspiracy wasn't just about stealing 3 acres of pretty mountain property. It was about stealing a geothermal energy site worth tens of millions of dollars. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Margaret hadn't just been trying to steal Sarah's dream home. She had been trying to steal a hidden fortune that would have made her one of the wealthiest women in Colorado. Judge Walsh looked stunned. Miss Henderson Clark, are you saying that? The defendants were aware of the geothermal energy potential when they planned this fraud? I believe so, Your Honor, and I have proof. Patricia held up a manila envelope. These are geological reports that my father kept hidden with his diary. They show that Margaret's husband conducted unauthorized surveys of our property in 1987 and 1994. He knew exactly what was there. Rebecca Santos immediately requested permission to examine the new evidence, and within an hour, she was back in court with an FBI forensic geologist, who confirmed that the Henderson property sat on one of the most promising geothermal sites in the Rocky Mountain region. Your Honor, Santos announced, this changes everything. The defendants weren't just committing property fraud. They were essentially committing grand theft of natural resources belonging to the people of Colorado. The state owns mineral and energy rights to all geothermal resources, which means this conspiracy also involved defrauding the state government. Judge Walsh was clearly overwhelmed by the scope of the criminal enterprise. that had been revealed in her courtroom, Miss Thornfield. Given these new revelations, I am going to ask you one final time if you wish to make a statement to this court. Margaret Thornfield finally stood, her hands shaking and her voice barely audible. Your Honor, I never meant for it to go this far. It started as a simple real estate investment. But when Thomas, my late husband, told me about the geological surveys, I got greedy. I thought we could make a quick profit and no one would get hurt. She turned to look at Sarah with tears in her eyes. Ms. Martinez, I am truly sorry for what I put you through. You didn't deserve any of this. You seem like a good person who just wanted a home, and I destroyed your life for money. Sarah stood up and walked toward Margaret, the entire courtroom watching in silence. When she reached the defense table, she leaned down and spoke quietly, so only Margaret could hear. Margaret, you didn't destroy my life. You gave me purpose. Because of your greed, we've exposed a criminal enterprise that was destroying families across 6 states. You've made me a millionaire, and more importantly, you've made me a fighter. So thank you. Margaret looked shocked, then broke down sobbing. Judge Walsh sentenced Margaret Thornfield to 15 years in federal prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to all victims. Judge Morrison received 20 years. The Pinnacle Corporation executives were looking at life sentences under RICO statutes. But for Sarah Martinez, the real victory wasn't the money or the justice, it was the knowledge that her fight had saved dozens of other families from losing their homes and dreams to corporate greed. As she walked out of the courthouse that day, Sarah's phone rang. It was a producer from a major television network who wanted to option her story for a documentary series about corporate corruption in America. Sarah looked up at the Colorado mountains and the distant mountains that now included 3 acres and a hidden geothermal fortune that belonged to her, and smiled. I have to think about it. She told the producer, I'm pretty busy right now. I have a geothermal energy company to start. The nurse who had been targeted because she seemed vulnerable had become the CEO of what would soon be one of Colorado's most successful green energy companies. And Margaret Thornfield, from her federal prison cell, would have many years to regret the day she decided to steal from the wrong woman. But that's a story for another day. Sarah Martinez had proven that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who has nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. If you're still here, I'd really like to know what this reminded you of or what you would have done in my place. And hey, if this story hits something in you and you want to support the channel, that little thanks button's always there. Thanks for hanging out. We're HOA Confessional Stories, and this is just one of many unbelievable tales. Catch more by checking out the next video. We promise it's even wilder.